The October wind cut through Millfield like a blade, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and the promise of a harsh winter. Sarah Macready sat on the weathered porch of her small cabin, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the patch of freshly turned earth beyond the fence line. The wooden cross stood crooked against the mountain backdrop, carved hastily but with trembling care. Emma Macready, age 7, beloved daughter. 3 weeks had passed since the fever took her little girl. 3 weeks since the doctor had shaken his head and quietly left their home. 3 weeks since Sarah had spoken a single word. The townspeople had tried at first. Martha from the general store brought soup that went cold on the porch steps. Reverend Campbell offered prayers that fell on deaf ears. Even old Tom the blacksmith, who rarely spoke to anyone, had awkwardly patted her shoulder and mumbled something about God's plan. But Sarah's silence was absolute, not the comfortable quiet of someone lost in thought, but the hollow silence of someone whose voice had simply vanished along with everything that mattered. Her husband Daniel had tried for the first week, pleading with her to eat, to speak, to acknowledge that he was drowning in his own grief and needed her to help him breathe. Then Daniel left, packed his belongings into a worn leather satchel and rode east toward Denver, leaving only a note on the kitchen table: "I can't watch you disappear too." Now Sarah sat alone as the sun painted the mountains gold, then purple, then black. The silence around her wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating, pressing down on the small cabin like the weight of the earth itself. But it was hers. It was all she had left of the world, where Emma's laughter had once echoed through these rooms. As darkness settled over Millfield, Sarah rose from her chair with the mechanical movements of someone going through motions without purpose. She walked inside, past Emma's untouched bed, past the rag doll still sitting on the wooden floor, past the half-finished embroidery that would never be completed. The silence followed her everywhere, but it no longer felt empty. It felt heavy, dangerous, like something that might swallow her whole if she let it. And perhaps, Sarah thought as she lay down fully clothed on her bed, that wouldn't be such a terrible thing. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Millfield in snow that muffled even the sounds of daily life. The town seemed to move in whispers, as if speaking too loudly might shatter something already broken beyond repair. Sarah's silence had become legendary, spoken about in hushed tones over coffee at Miller's Cafe and debated by the Women's Auxiliary after Sunday service. At first, the community had rallied around her with the fierce determination of frontier people who understood loss. But as weeks turned to months, their patience began to wear thin. "It's not natural," Martha whispered to her husband while counting inventory. "A woman needs to grieve proper and then get on with living. This ain't grieving. This is giving up." Reverend Campbell had tried visiting every Sunday for 6 weeks, reading scripture aloud to Sarah's unresponsive form on the porch. When the snows came and she moved inside, he knocked on her door each week, calling out verses about comfort and healing to the silent walls. Eventually, even his faith in reaching her began to waver. "Perhaps," he confided to his wife over dinner, "some wounds are too deep for earthly healing." The town's concern shifted gradually from active help to passive avoidance. People crossed to the other side of the muddy main street when they saw Sarah walking to the general store for supplies. Children were warned to stay away from the quiet lady's house. Even the weekly visits from well-meaning neighbors stopped. Sarah noticed. How could she not? But their abandonment felt like a natural consequence of her choice. She had stepped outside the world of the living, and the living had let her go. It was on a particularly bitter February morning, when the snow fell so thick it erased the mountains from view, that John Whitmore first appeared on her porch. He didn't knock, didn't call out. He simply sat down on the wooden steps, pulled his worn coat tighter around his shoulders, and waited. Sarah watched him through the frost-covered window, this stranger who seemed content to sit in the falling snow. He was tall and lean, with the weathered hands of a working man and grey threading through his brown hair. She didn't recognize him. though Millfield was small enough that she should know every face. After an hour, he stood up, tipped his hat to the window where she stood watching, and walked away. The next morning, he was back. This time, Sarah cracked the door open and stared at him. He looked up from where he sat whittling a piece of wood, meeting her eyes with a steady gaze that held no expectation, no demand for explanation. "Ma'am," he said simply, touching the brim of his hat. Then he returned to his carving. Sarah closed the door, but she didn't move away from it. For the first time in months, she felt something other than emptiness. Confusion, perhaps, or the faintest spark of curiosity about why a stranger would choose to sit in the cold outside her door, asking for nothing. When she looked out an hour later, he was gone. But carved into the porch step was a small wooden bird, its wings spread as if caught mid-flight. That night, Sarah picked up the carving and held it in her palm, running her fingers over the smooth wood. It was the first thing that had felt real to her since Emma died. Spring came slowly to the mountains, melting the snow in reluctant patches and revealing the brown earth beneath. John Whitmore came every day. He never asked Sarah to speak, never tried to coax her out of her silence with cheerful conversation or gentle prodding. Instead, he simply existed in her space, carving small figures, mending her broken fence posts, or just sitting quietly as the world woke up around them. Sarah found herself anticipating his arrival each morning. She would position herself by the window, watching the empty road until his familiar figure appeared over the hill. He walked with the steady gait of a man who had nowhere urgent to be, carrying a small leather satchel that held his carving tools and whatever project occupied his hands that day. Slowly, Sarah began to venture outside while he worked. At first, she sat on the opposite end of the porch, maintaining careful distance. But John's presence was unlike anything she had experienced since Emma's death. He didn't fill the silence with meaningless chatter or awkward attempts at comfort. He simply let the silence exist, treating it not as something to be fixed, but as something to be respected. "Lost my boy in the war," he said one afternoon, not looking up from the wooden horse he was carving. It was the first personal thing he had shared, spoken so quietly Sarah almost thought she had imagined it. Antietam. He was 19. Sarah's hands stilled on the mending she had picked up, the first domestic task she had attempted in months. She looked at John's profile, seeing for the first time the deep lines around his eyes, the careful way he held his shoulders as if carrying invisible weight. "Doctor said he died brave," John continued, his knife moving in precise, practiced strokes. "Said he called for his mama at the end." He paused, testing the smoothness of the horse's neck with his thumb. "Been 8 years now. Still can't talk about it much, but sitting quiet with someone who understands, that helps." That afternoon, Sarah moved her chair closer to his. As the weeks passed, they developed a rhythm. John would arrive with the morning light, work on whatever needed doing around the small property, and sit with Sarah as the day unfolded. He fixed her roof, reinforced her chicken coop, and planted a small garden behind the house, all without being asked, without expectation of thanks or payment. Sarah began to help. Small gestures at first, bringing him water while he worked, holding boards steady while he hammered. Then larger ones, cooking simple meals that they shared in comfortable silence, washing and mending his work shirts when they became torn. She still didn't speak, but her silence began to change. Where once it had been the heavy quiet of despair, it became something different, peaceful perhaps, or at least not painful. John seemed to understand this distinction. He would catch her eye sometimes and nod, as if acknowledging that they were speaking a language that had nothing to do with words. One evening in late May, as they sat watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and red, John set down his carving and looked at Sarah directly. "Don't need to talk to be heard," he said simply, "and don't need words to heal. But when you're ready, if you're ready, I'll be listening." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, like ice beginning to crack after a long winter. She reached over and touched his hand. the first time she had initiated physical contact with another human being since Emma died. They sat like that as darkness fell, her small hand resting on his weathered one, both of them listening to the sound of the world breathing around them. Summer arrived with a burst of wildflowers across the mountain meadows, transforming the harsh landscape into something surprisingly gentle. Sarah's garden flourished under John's patient care and her own tentative attention. The wooden animals he carved had multiplied, creating a small menagerie along the porch railing: horses and birds, a sleeping cat, a doe with her fawn. Sarah had begun to take walks with John in the evenings, their footsteps creating a quiet rhythm on the mountain paths. They would stop at the cemetery where Emma lay, and Sarah would arrange the wildflowers she had picked, while John stood respectfully nearby. He never rushed these moments, never showed impatience with her need to linger. It was during one of these visits, on a warm July evening when the air was thick with the scent of pine and summer grass, that Sarah felt the first stirring of words in her throat. She knelt beside Emma's grave, arranging a bouquet of mountain lupins, when she noticed something that made her breath catch. A small wooden butterfly sat among the flowers from her last visit, one of John's carvings, placed there without fanfare or announcement. Sarah looked up at John, who was studying the mountains with the careful attention of a man giving her privacy for grief. Something in her chest loosened, like a knot that had been slowly working itself free. She would have loved that, Sarah whispered. The words were barely audible, rusty from months of disuse, but they hung in the evening air like something precious. John turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers with an expression of such gentle understanding that Sarah felt tears, the first she had shed since Emma's death, begin to flow. She loved butterflies, Sarah continued, her voice growing slightly stronger. Used to chase them through the meadow behind our old house in Kansas. Daniel said she was trying to catch their colors. John moved closer, settling down on the grass beside her. "Tell me about her," he said simply. And for the first time since Emma died, Sarah did. The words came slowly at first, like water beginning to flow from a long dry well. She told him about Emma's laugh, about how she had insisted on naming every chicken in their small flock, about the way she would fall asleep, clutching her rag doll and humming songs she made up herself. As she spoke, Sarah felt something extraordinary happening. Each word, each memory shared, felt like a small piece of Emma coming back to life. Not in a supernatural way, but in the very human way that stories keep the dead alive in the hearts of the living. "She was teaching me to braid her hair," Sarah said, her fingers unconsciously working through the motions. "Every morning, she'd sit on my lap, and we'd practice. She was getting so good at it. Said she wanted to teach other little girls when she grew up." John listened without interruption, offering the same steady presence he had given her silence. When Sarah's words finally trailed off as the first stars appeared, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something wrapped in soft cloth. "Been working on this," he said, unwrapping a small wooden girl with carefully carved braids. "Thought Emma might like to have company." Sarah took the figure with trembling hands, seeing in its simple face and tiny braids the echo of her daughter's spirit. But instead of the crushing grief she expected, she felt something else: gratitude. Gratitude for John's understanding, for his patience, for the way he had honored both her silence and her need to speak. "Thank you," she whispered, and meant it in ways that went far beyond the wooden doll. As they walked home through the darkening meadow, Sarah's voice returned in fits and starts. She told John about her marriage to Daniel, about their journey west, about dreams they had shared for the life they would build. She spoke of her anger at God, her fury at a world that could take a child so young, her guilt at being unable to save Emma from the fever that had burned through their small town. John listened to it all, the love and the rage, the memories and the regrets, with the same steady attention he had given her silence. "Grieving's not something you finish," he said as they reached her porch. "It's something you learn to carry, and it's easier when you don't have to carry it alone." That night, Sarah sat by her window looking out at the small wooden animals lined up on the porch railing. For the first time since Emma's death, the silence in her house didn't feel empty. It felt full of possibility, of connection, of the quiet understanding that healing wasn't about forgetting or moving on, but about learning to hold both grief and joy in the same heart. She thought about John's daily presence, about the way he had chosen to sit with her pain instead of trying to fix it. She thought about the words that had finally come, not because he had demanded them, but because he had made space for them. And as she drifted off to sleep, Sarah realized that tomorrow she would tell him about the letters she had been writing to Emma in her mind, all the conversations they would never have, all the milestones she would never witness. Maybe with John's patient listening, she could find a way to say those words aloud too. The silence was breaking, but not shattering. It was opening, like a flower finally ready to bloom. The autumn air carried the familiar bite of approaching winter, but Sarah no longer dreaded the cold months ahead. She stood in her garden, harvesting the last of the season's vegetables, while John repaired the fence that had been damaged in the previous week's storm. They had developed an easy rhythm over the months, working together, sharing meals, talking about everything and nothing. Sarah's voice had grown strong again, but she had learned to value silence too, understanding now that quiet could be a choice rather than a prison. Daniel had returned in the spring, traveling from Denver with divorce papers and a face full of guilt. Sarah had signed them without anger, understanding that some people need to run from grief while others need to sit still with it. There were no hard feelings, only the quiet acknowledgement that they had become different people, shaped by their different ways of surviving loss. The Hendersons' baby took sick yesterday, John mentioned, straightening up from his work. Mary Henderson's been sitting up with her for 2 days straight. Sarah nodded, understanding the implication. She had become the person other townspeople came to when words failed them, when tragedies struck, and silence felt safer than speech. She would sit with them, offering the same patient presence John had given her, proving that healing could happen in the space between heartbeats, in the pause between words. "I'll go to her tomorrow," Sarah said simply. That evening, as they had for months now, Sarah and John walked to the cemetery to visit Emma. The wooden butterfly was weathered now, but still rested among the flowers. Sarah knelt and placed fresh mountain asters around the grave, then settled back on her heels. "I told her about us," she said quietly, "about how you helped me find my voice again." John's hand found hers, warm and steady. "What did you tell her?" Sarah smiled, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest that came with talking about Emma. But it was a good ache now, the ache of love remembered rather than love lost. "I told her that sometimes the most important conversations happen without words," she said, "and that healing sounds like someone choosing to stay." And as they walked home under the emerging stars, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The silence that had once threatened to consume her had become something else entirely, a foundation for deeper listening, for presence, for the kind of love that doesn't require explanation or justification. She had learned that grief doesn't end, but it transforms. That healing isn't about returning to who you were before, but about discovering who you can become after. And that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is simply showing up and staying, even when, especially when, there are no words left to say. The mountain wind whispered through the pines as they reached the cabin, and Sarah listened to it with the same attention John had once given her silence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations, new opportunities to sit with others in their pain and their healing. But tonight, she was simply grateful for the words that had returned, for the silence that had taught her their value, and for the man who had proven that love sometimes sounds like nothing at all. The autumn of 1887 came to Millfield with a gentleness that Sarah had never experienced before. The mountains, painted in shades of gold and crimson, seemed to embrace the small town with maternal tenderness, And for the first time in as long as she could remember, Sarah didn't feel the familiar weight of melancholy that usually accompanied this season. She sat on the porch of her house, now our house as she naturally thought of it, watching John teach young Timothy Henderson to carve wood. The 8-year-old boy had become a regular visitor, especially after his mother Mary had gone through a difficult period the previous winter when she lost a baby in the womb. Sarah had been there, sitting in silence beside Mary during the long nights of pain, offering the same patient presence that John had once given her. Like this, slow and steady, John was saying, guiding Timothy's small hands. The wood will tell you what it wants to become. You just need to listen. Sarah smiled, recognizing the philosophy she had learned from John applied not just to carving, but to life itself. At 32, she had discovered that healing truly worked this way. You couldn't force it, only create space for it to happen naturally. The house had transformed over the years. What had once been a place haunted by silence now resonated with gentle conversation, occasional laughter, and yes, moments of silence too. But chosen silence, comfortable silence, full of mutual understanding. John had officially moved in 2 years ago, after a simple wedding performed by Reverend Campbell in the spring of 1885. There had been no grand celebration, just a few close friends, wildflowers, and promises made in quiet but firm voices. The walls now housed an impressive collection of John's carvings, not just the small animals he had made during those first months, but larger, more complex works. There was an entire relief of the mountain landscape above the fireplace, decorative panels on the doors, and small sculptures on every shelf. Each piece told a story, and Sarah had learned to read these wooden stories like others read books. The garden had expanded considerably. What began as a small vegetable plot now extended to the tree line, including not just vegetables and herbs, but flowers, many flowers. Daisies, which Emma had loved, mountain lupins that grew wild in the meadows, and a special butterfly garden that attracted entire flocks of these delicate insects during summer. "Mrs. Whitmore," Timothy called, interrupting her thoughts. John said you used to not talk. Is that true?" Sarah exchanged a glance with John, who shrugged with an amused smile. They had never hidden the story of how they met, but they didn't tell it often either. Timothy, however, had the natural curiosity of a child, and the persistence of someone who had learned that honest questions usually received honest answers. "It's true," said Sarah, setting aside the embroidery she had been working on, a new skill she had acquired in recent years. "For a long time after my daughter died, I simply couldn't find words." "And how did you find them again?" Sarah looked at John, who was helping Timothy smooth a rough surface of the wood, and felt the familiar wave of gratitude that still surprised her with its intensity. "Someone taught me that sometimes the most important thing you can do for another person is simply stay close to them, even when there's nothing to say." Timothy considered this with the seriousness of a child processing complex concepts. "Like my mama did when I had nightmares after the baby died." "Exactly like your mama did," confirmed Sarah, feeling her heart tighten with tenderness at the boy's early understanding of loss and healing. In the 5 years since John had first appeared on her porch, Sarah had become a known figure in the community in a way she never imagined possible. Word had spread beyond Millfield about the woman who knew how to sit with people in their pain. Travelers sometimes made detours to visit her, bringing their own stories of loss and silence. There was Margaret, a widow from Denver, who had lost her husband in a mining accident and couldn't stop crying. Sarah had sat with her for 3 entire days, offering handkerchiefs and presents until the tears finally subsided to a manageable level. There was the young soldier who had returned from the Indian Wars with eyes that could no longer see beauty in the world. John and Sarah had worked with him for months, teaching him to carve, to plant, to find purpose in small acts of creation. There were entire families who had lost everything in fires, storms, diseases. Each brought their own version of silence, and Sarah had learned that there were as many different types of silence as there were types of pain. "Mrs. Whitmore," Timothy said suddenly, "do you still get sad about Emma?" The question, asked with the brutal honesty of childhood, might have been devastating a few years before. Now Sarah received it as a gift, an opportunity to articulate something she had taken years to understand completely. "I do," she said simply, "and I think I always will. But I learned that you can be sad about someone and happy about other things at the same time. The heart is bigger than I thought." John stopped carving for a moment and looked at her with that expression that still made her feel seen in a way that went beyond words. It was the same look he had given her that first day when she had cracked the door to peek at him, without judgment, without hurry, just quiet recognition of who she was. The afternoon passed with the gentle rhythm that had become the trademark of their lives. Timothy finished his small wooden bird with evident pride, and Sarah prepared tea and biscuits to share on the porch. Conversations flowed and ebbed naturally, punctuated by comfortable periods of silence where each lost themselves in their own thoughts. When the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of pink and gold, Timothy said goodbye and ran down the trail back to town, waving his carved bird in the air as if it were flying. Sarah and John took their usual evening walk to the cemetery. Emma's grave was now surrounded by a small garden that changed with the seasons: tulips in spring, sunflowers in summer, chrysanthemums in autumn, evergreens in winter. The original wooden cross had been replaced by a proper headstone, but John's small carving still rested among the flowers. "Brought something for her," John said, pulling a small wrapped bundle from his pocket. Inside was the most elaborate of his carvings yet, a complete scene carved from a single piece of wood, showing a girl with braids running through a field of flowers, chasing butterflies. It was Emma, clearly, captured not as she had died, but as she had lived, full of movement, joy, and curiosity. Sarah took the carving with trembling hands, tracing the intricate details with her fingers. John had worked on this in secret for months, she realized, creating not just a work of art, but a form of memory that honored not the loss, but the life. "It's perfect," she whispered, and for the first time in a long while, she cried, not from sadness, but from a more complex emotion that included gratitude, love, and the sweet pain of being truly understood. As they walked back home under the first stars, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her here. 5 years ago, she had been a woman destroyed by silence, unable to imagine a future worth living. Now, she was someone other people sought out when they needed to learn how to carry their own pain. The change hadn't been dramatic or sudden. It had been a gradual process of small moments. The first word spoken, the first laugh shared, the first time she had been able to think of Emma without feeling like she was drowning. Each small step had built upon the previous one, creating a solid foundation for a life that was different from what she had planned, but no less valuable. "John," she said as they approached the house where golden candlelight glowed through the windows, "do you think Emma would approve of the person I've become?" John stopped walking and turned to face her completely. His eyes, now familiar after all these years, still had the ability to make her feel like she was the only person in the world. "I think she'd be proud," he said simply. "You took the worst thing that could happen to a mother and turned it into something that helps other people. That's not just survival, Sarah. That's courage." As they entered the house, Sarah knew he was right. She had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear or pain, but the willingness to keep living and loving despite them. She had learned that healing didn't mean forgetting or getting over something, but integrating the loss into the texture of a life that could still be beautiful. And perhaps most importantly, she had learned that love, real, lasting love, didn't always come with words. Sometimes it came as someone willing to sit on your porch in the snow day after day, asking for nothing more than permission to stay. That night, As they prepared for sleep, Sarah looked out the window at the mountains she now truly considered home. Somewhere out there, other people were struggling with their own silences, carrying their own losses. Tomorrow, perhaps some of them would find their way to her door, and she would be ready for them, with the patience John had taught her, with the understanding that pain had given her, and with the quiet certainty that healing was always possible, not despite suffering, but through it. The mountain wind whispered through the pines outside, and Sarah listened to it with the same reverent attention that John had once given to her silence. It was the sound of a world continuing to breathe, to grow, to heal, and for the first time since she could remember, she felt completely part of that world again. In the morning she knew there would be new visitors, new stories of loss to witness, new forms of silence to understand. The ripples of what John had started by simply choosing to sit with her had spread far beyond what either of them could have imagined. People traveled from neighboring towns, even from as far as Denver and Colorado Springs, seeking the woman who had learned to transform silence into healing. Some came carrying grief so fresh it still bled. Others brought old wounds that had never properly healed. There were mothers who had lost children, children who had lost parents, spouses left behind, and souls simply lost in the wilderness of their own despair. Sarah met them all with the same gentle presence John had shown her, not trying to fix or rush or explain away their pain, but simply creating space for it to exist without judgment. She had become fluent in the many languages of loss, understanding that sometimes healing looked like tears, sometimes like anger, and sometimes like the long, necessary silence that came before words could be found again. The house had become a sanctuary of sorts, though neither she nor John had ever intended it that way. It simply happened, as naturally as flowers growing towards sunlight. People found their way there when traditional sources of comfort had failed them, when well-meaning friends and family had exhausted their patience with grief that didn't follow expected timelines. As Sarah finally drifted off to sleep, John's steady breathing beside her, she thought about Emma one more time. Her daughter would be 12 now, if she had lived, old enough to understand loss herself, old enough perhaps to appreciate the strange gift that had emerged from her death. Sarah imagined Emma approving of the woman her mother had become, proud that her brief life had somehow planted seeds of healing that continued to grow years after she was gone. The silence in the house was complete now, but it was the rich silence of contentment, of purpose fulfilled, of love freely given and received. It was the silence that comes after words have done their work, after understanding has been reached, after hearts have found their way home. And in that silence, Sarah could almost hear it, the sound of healing happening, quiet and persistent as mountain streams, flowing through all the broken places and making them whole again.